everyone, welcome back to YouTube channel, The Ultimate Audiobook. The 3rd Century Crisis. If the 1st and 2nd centuries were by and large a period of peace, prosperity, and economic expansion, the 3rd century brought the first major signs of internal strain. From the 230s, the empire found itself fighting on several fronts simultaneously. In Iran, a new and more aggressive dynasty emerged in 225. They called themselves the Sasanians, and within just 15 years were expanding rapidly in the direction of the Euphrates. In a famous rock inscription cut in 3 languages, Shapur I, the Iranian ruler, claimed he had annihilated a Roman army of 60,000 and even captured the eastern capital of Antioch. Meanwhile, a whole series of Germanic tribes, or rather tribal confederacies, most notably the Alemanni, the Franks, and the Goths, began to move against the Rhine and Danube frontiers. And the whole period from 233 to 280 saw repeated invasions of a whole line of provinces that stretched from the Black Sea to the Alps and southern Germany. The Romans were forced to abandon much of the territory beyond the Danube, while the emperors of this period were constantly in the field against what the Romans called barbarians. The rapid succession of emperors in the 3rd century, 25 emperors in 47 years, is an obvious symptom of the strains faced by the empire in this period. Gender, literacy, culture. One of the more modern features of Roman society was the widespread prevalence of the nuclear family. Adult sons did not live with their families, and it was exceptional for adult brothers to share a common household. On the other hand, slaves were included in the family as the Romans understood this. By the late Republic, the 1st century BC, the typical form of marriage was one where the wife did not transfer to her husband's authority but retained full rights in the property of her natal family. While the woman's dowry went to the husband for the duration of the marriage, the woman remained a primary heir of her father and became an independent property owner on her father's estate. Thus, the Roman women enjoyed considerable legal rights in owning and managing property. In other words, in law, the married couple was not one financial entity, but two, and the wife enjoyed completely legal independence. Divorce was relatively easy and needed no more than a notice of intent to dissolve the marriage by either husband or wife. On the other hand, whereas males married in their late 20s or early 30s, women were married off in the late teens or early 20s. So there was an age gap between husband and wife, and this would have encouraged a certain inequality. Marriages were generally arranged, and there is no doubt that women were often subject to domination by their husbands. Augustine, the great Catholic bishop who spent most of his life in North Africa, tells us that his mother was regularly beaten by his father and that most other wives in the small town where he grew up had similar bruises to show. Finally, fathers had substantial legal control over their children, sometimes to a shocking degree. For example, a legal power of life and death in exposing unwanted children by leaving them out in the cold to die. Saint Augustine, 354 to 430, was bishop of the North African city of Hippo from 396 and a towering figure in the intellectual history of the Church. Bishops were the most important religious figures in a Christian community and often very powerful. The use of reading and writing in everyday, often trivial, context. What about literacy? It is certain that rates of casual literacy varied greatly between different parts of the empire. For example, in Pompeii, which was buried in a volcanic eruption in 79 CE, there is strong evidence of widespread casual literacy. Walls on the main streets of Pompeii often carried advertisements, and graffiti were found all over the city. By contrast, in Egypt, where hundreds of papyri survive, most formal documents such as contracts were usually written by professional scribes, and they often tell us that X or Y is unable to read and write. But even here, literacy was certainly more widespread among certain categories such as soldiers, army officers, and estate managers. One of the funniest of this graffiti, found on the walls of Pompeii, says, "Wall, I admire you for not collapsing in twins when you have to support so much boring writing on you." The cultural diversity of the empire was reflected in many ways and at many levels. In the vast diversity of religious cults and local deities, the plurality of languages that are spoken, the styles of dress and costume, the food people ate, the forms of social organization, tribal or non-tribal, even their patterns of settlement. Aramaic was the dominant language group of the Near East, at least west of the Euphrates. Coptic was spoken in Egypt, Punic and Berber in North Africa, Celtic in Spain and the Northwest. But many of these linguistic cultures were purely oral, at least until a script was invented for them. Armenian, for example, only began to be written as late as the 5th century, whereas there was already a Coptic translation of the Bible by the middle of the 3rd century. Elsewhere, the spread of Latin displays the written form of languages that are otherwise widespread. This happened notably with Celtic, which ceased to be written after the 4th century. Economic expansion. The empire had a substantial economic infrastructure of harbors, mines, quarries, brickyards, olive oil factories, etc. Wheat, wine, and olive oil were traded and consumed in huge quantities, and they came mainly from Spain, the Gallic provinces, North Africa, Egypt, and to a lesser extent Italy, where conditions were best for these crops. Liquids like wine and olive oil were transported in containers called amphorae. The fragments and shards of a very large number of these survive. Monte Testaccio in Rome is said to contain the remnants of over 50 million vessels, and it has been possible for archaeologists to reconstruct the precise shapes of these containers, tell us what they carried, and say exactly where they were made by examining the clay content and matching the finds with clay pits throughout the Mediterranean. In this way, we can now say with some confidence that Spanish olive oil, to take just one example, was a vast commercial enterprise that reached its peak in the years 140 to 160. The Spanish olive oil of this period was mainly carried in a container called Vessel 20, after the archaeologists who first established its form. If finds of Vessel 20 are widely scattered across sites in the Mediterranean, this suggests that Spanish olive oil circulated very widely indeed. By using such evidence, archaeologists are able to show that Spanish producers succeeded in capturing markets for olive oil from their Italian counterparts. This would only have happened if Spanish producers supplied a better quality oil at lower prices. In other words, the big landowners from different regions competed with each other for control of the main markets for the goods they produced. The success of the Spanish olive growers was then repeated by North African producers. Olive estates in this part of the empire dominated production through most of the 3rd and 4th centuries. Later, after 425, North African dominance was broken by the East. In the later 5th and 6th centuries, the Asian, Southern Asia Minor, Turkey, Syria, and Palestine became major exporters of wine and olive oil, and containers from Africa show a dramatically reduced presence on Mediterranean markets. Behind these broad movements, the prosperity of individual regions rose and fell depending on how effectively they could organize the production and transport of particular goods and on the quality of those goods. The empire included many regions that had a reputation for exceptional fertility. Campania in Italy, Sicily, the Fayum in Egypt, Galilee, Bajatium, Tunisia, southern Gaul, called Gallia Narbonensis, and Baetica, southern Spain, were all among the most densely settled or wealthiest parts of the empire, according to writers like Strabo and Pliny. The best kinds of wine came from Campania. Sicily and Byzantium exported large quantities of wheat to Rome. Galilee was densely cultivated. Every inch of the soil has been cultivated by the inhabitants, wrote the historian Josephus. And Spanish olive oil came mainly from numerous estates along the banks of the river Guadalquivir in the south of Spain. On the other hand, large expanses of Roman territory were in a much less advanced state. For example, transhumance was widespread in the countryside of Numidia, modern Algeria. These pastoral and semi-nomadic communities were often on the move, carrying their oven-shaped huts, called mapalia, with them. As Roman estates expanded in North Africa, the pastures of those communities were drastically reduced and their movements were tightly regulated. Even in Spain, the north was much less developed and inhabited largely by a Celtic-speaking peasantry that lived in hilltop villages called casella. When we think of the Roman Empire, we should never forget these differences. Transhumance is the herdsman's regular annual movement between the higher mountain regions and low-lying ground in search of pasture for sheep and other flocks. We should also be careful not to imagine that because this was the ancient world, their forms of cultural and economic life were necessarily backward or primitive. On the contrary, diversified applications of water power around the Mediterranean, as well as advances in water-powered milling technology, the use of hydraulic mining techniques in the Spanish gold and silver mines, and the gigantic industrial scale on which those mines were worked in the 1st and 2nd centuries, with levels of output that would not be reached again till the 19th century, some 1,700 years later. The existence of well-organized commercial and banking networks and the widespread use of money are all indications of how much we tend to underestimate the sophistication of the Roman economy. This raises the issue of labor and of the use of slavery. Controlling workers. Slavery was an institution deeply rooted in the ancient world, both in the Mediterranean and in the Near East, and not even Christianity, when it emerged and triumphed as a state religion in the 4th century, seriously challenged this institution. It does not follow that the bulk of the labor in the Roman economy was performed by slaves. That may have been true of large parts of Italy in the Republican period, Under Augustus, there were still 3 million slaves in a total Italian population of 7.5 million, but it was no longer true of the empire as a whole. Slaves were an investment, and at least one Roman agricultural writer advised landowners against using them in contexts where too many might be required, for example, for harvest, or where their health could be damaged, for example, by malaria. These considerations were not based on any sympathy for the slaves, but on hard economic calculation. On the other hand, if the Roman upper classes were often brutal towards their slaves, ordinary people did sometimes show much more compassion. See what one historian says about a famous incident that occurred in the reign of Nero. On the treatment of slaves, soon afterwards the city prefect, Lucius Petanius Secundus, was murdered by one of his slaves. After the murder, ancient custom required that every slave residing under the same roof must be executed. But a crowd gathered, eager to save so many innocent lives, and rioting began. The Senate House was besieged. Inside, there was feeling against excessive severity, but the majority opposed any change. Favoring execution prevailed. However, great crowds, ready with stones and torches, prevented the order from being carried out. Nero rebuked the population by edict, and lined with troops the whole route along which those condemned were taken for execution. As warfare became less widespread with the establishment of peace in the first century, the supply of slaves tended to decline, and the users of slave labor thus had to turn either to slave breeding or to cheaper substitutes such as wage labor, which was more easily dispensable. In fact, free labor was extensively used in public works at Rome precisely because an extensive use of slave labor would have been too expensive. Unlike hired workers, slaves had to be fed and maintained throughout the year, which increased the cost of holding this kind of labor. This is probably why slaves are not widely found in the agriculture of the later period, at least not in the eastern provinces. On the other hand, they and freedmen, that is, slaves who had been set free by their masters, were extensively used as business managers, where obviously they were not required in large numbers. Masters often gave their slaves or freedmen capital to run businesses on their behalf or even businesses of their own. The Roman agricultural writers paid a great deal of attention to the management of labor. Columella, a 4th century writer who came from the south of Spain, recommended that landowners should keep a reserve stock of implements and tools, twice as many as they needed, so that production could be continuous. For the loss in slave labor, time exceeds the cost of such items. There was a general presumption among employers that without supervision no work could ever get done. So supervision was paramount for both free workers and slaves. To make supervision easier, workers were sometimes grouped into gangs or smaller teams. Columella recommended squads of 10, claiming it was easier to tell who was putting in effort and who was not in work groups of this size. This shows a detailed consideration of the management of labor. Pliny the Elder, the author of a very famous natural history, condemned the use of slave gangs as the worst method of organizing production, mainly because slaves who worked in gangs were usually chained together by their feet. All this looks draconian, but we should remember that most factories in the world today enforce similar principles of labor control. Indeed, some industrial establishments in the empire enforced even tighter controls. The elder Pliny described conditions in the frankincense factories of Alexandria, where he tells us no amount of supervision seemed to suffice. A seal is put upon the workmen's aprons. They have to wear a mask or a net with a closed mesh on their heads, and before they are allowed to leave the premises, they have to take off all their clothes. Agricultural labor must have been fatiguing and disliked, for a famous edict of the early 3rd century refers to Egyptian peasants deserting their villages in order not to engage in agricultural work. The same was probably true of most factories and workshops. A law of 398 referred to workers being branded so they could be recognized if and when they run away and try to hide. Many private employers cast their agreements with workers in the form of debt contracts to be able to claim that their employees were in debt to them and thus ensure tighter control over them. An early 2nd century writer tells us thousands surrender themselves to work in servitude, although they are free. In other words, a lot of the poorer families went into debt bondage in order to survive. From one of the recently discovered letters of Augustine, we learn that parents sometimes sold their children into servitude for periods of 25 years. Augustine asked a lawyer friend of his whether their children could be liberated once the father died. Rural indebtedness was even more widespread. To take just one example, in the Great Jewish Revolt of 66 CE, the revolutionaries destroyed the moneylenders' bonds to win popular support. Again, we should be careful not to conclude that the bulk of labor was coerced in these ways. The late 5th century Emperor Anastasius built the eastern frontier city of Dara in less than 3 weeks by attracting labor from all over the east by offering high wages. From the papyri, we can even form some estimate of how widespread wage labor had become in parts of the Mediterranean by the 6th century, especially in the east. A rebellion in Judea against Roman domination, which was ruthlessly suppressed by the Romans in what is called the Jewish War. Thank you, and bye bye everyone.